On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World Redux series. Our magazine partner is the week Journalism with a Human Touch. Those of you who missed our earlier episodes, Strange Flowers, Donald Ryan in conversation with Kaveri Madhavan, you may catch this on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest, and on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest. As part of JLF's Brave New World Season 1 Redux, we present our second session of the day. Present tense from the Battlefront, Ambarish Satwik and Arunava Sinha in conversation. Even as the medical establishment battles the virus, there are rifts and contradictions within. Vascular surgeon and writer Ambarish Satwik speaks with literary translator Arunava Sinha about the terrors of the pandemic across the perspective of history and literature, as well as in the present tense. Ambarish Satwik is a Delhi-based vascular and endovascular surgeon and writer. Dr. Satwik is the author of the critically acclaimed novel, Perineum, Neither Parts of the Empire. The book has often been introduced as a rogue and deviant, fictive sexual history of the British Raj. Arunava Sinha translates classic, modern and contemporary Bengali fiction and non-fiction from Bangladesh and India into English. His recent translations include Kunal Basu's The Endgame, Bani Basu's Moon, Taslima Nasreen's Shameless, Desire for Fire, Modern Bengali Poetry and Translation, and the forthcoming Akhtar Uzam's Elias's Pub Nama. All our sessions are available on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Ladies and gentlemen, present tense from the Battlefront, Ambarish Satwik and Arunava Sinha in conversation.
Thank you, Sanjay. Good evening, Ambarish.
Good evening.
This makes a difference from the way we usually meet at Jaipur Litfests.
Indeed. No, but thank you. I must thank Sanjay for having me. I'm possessed of no distinguishing talents that actually enable me to be here in the company of all the people that he mentioned. But thank you. I'm honored.
Well, that's not quite true. And anyone who heard you frame that first sentence will know straight away how untrue it is. But still, so let's. I know it's very difficult for us to tear our minds away from the situation that we are enveloped in. But if I may, let me take you and all of us back to your book, Perineum, and to one particular episode in it, which took place over 100 years ago, but of such magnitude that was perhaps considered even more disastrous than the current one is to the denizens of that time. And that, of course, is the bubonic plague attack in Bombay in the last years of the 19th century. And one of your episodes, which stars Dr. Hafkin, is located in the midst of that attack. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about how much of that work that you wrote was fiction, and maybe tell us in the process how fiction draws from these realities that are around us?
Well, yes, this was a particularly idiosyncratic part of colonial history. The Bombay, the story is called Bombay Bubonic, and it's situated at the time of the bubonic plague in Bombay, which started off in 1896. And in texture and acuity, I think it was completely different from the other pandemics that we've had. Yes, it introduces the enigmatic figure of Waldemar Hafkin, who's a Jew from Odessa in Ukraine. And in the run-up, in about 1893, he finds himself in Calcutta because he's flushed with the success of the anti-cholera vaccine that he's developed. And he's in Calcutta for the first trials in Asia. And he manages to complete some of them, and that's when the bubonic plague hits Bombay. And he's summoned by the imperial government to come and work in Bombay and kind of rescue the situation because it's getting completely out of hand. And he starts a laboratory in a tiny corridor outside the main laboratory of what was Frangi Petit lab in Grant Medical College, in a tiny room, and starts working on his vaccine. He sees patients, he conducts autopsies on patients, isolates the bacillus, and starts making vaccines. And the story, which is called Bombay Bubonic, is actually a love story of his amorous fondness for his Parsi subordinate clerk. And he inoculates himself with the bacillus. In fact, in a dose that's 4 times the standard for any vaccine. And his subordinate clerk, whom he's romantically associated with, and both of them managed to survive the plague epidemic. He then starts testing it on prisoners in the Baikala House of Corrections, and all of them survive the plague epidemic. So it's a kind of love story with that sort of a background, slightly smutty, slightly naughty kind of story, but I'm immensely taken by the Bombay plague, and as I said, that it's slightly different in texture and acuity, because you've got this wonderful word which has been completely wiped out from usage, which is called ratfall. It's a very fine word, which is when in your homes in those days, rats would kind of fall off the ceiling or the rafters, and you would feel a kind of, at night in the small hours of morning, you'd feel a kind of stirring in your bedclothes, which was not really related to desire, and you'd find that it was a dying rat trying to burrow into your bedclothes. And you would find that in other parts of the house, toddlers were kind of chasing another dying rat who was kind of staggering in a drunken state. And exactly after these happenings, you found that 10 days after this, bubonic plague would hit the neighborhood. Okay, so ratfall and these kind of incidentals and accessories of the epidemic are completely lacking now. I mean, you find that people are, this is their first brush with a consideration of their own mortality, and kind of fear of death is settled on most cities. But these kind of appurtenances of the epidemic aren't here. The only appurtenance of this epidemic that you can see is the mask, nothing else.
Yeah. So one of the things you just mentioned was the fact that the vaccine was tried on the inmates of the Baikala jail, effectively, right? Although it was called a correctional. That's a very scary thought, that people who are incarcerated for reasons of having broken the law become human guinea pigs. Was that a practice that was continued for a long time? And is it likely to, does it interest people?
So, well, I don't know if, so I can't claim to be a historian of epidemics, so I wouldn't know what happened subsequently, but for the time frame of my narrative, it definitely was carried out. And it was also, vaccination was usually for volunteers, but you needed a kind of captive audience, a captive group of a cohort which would be subjected to vaccination, and the easiest cohort you could find would be the ones who would be vulnerable to plague, because there would be a form of containment in the House of Corrections, and they wouldn't have any say in the matter. They couldn't refuse vaccination. But as I said, surprisingly, all of them survived while the city was crashing and burning around them.
Why do you say surprisingly?
Because the city was crashing and burning around them. People were dying, dropping dead. The thing is that there is this, and I keep coming back to the current epidemic, because in the Greek tragedies, they used a very clever device, which was that most of the horrific occurrences were kept off stage, okay, and out of scene, right? And that's the dubious kind of etymology of the word obscene. Something is an obscenity. So you were seeing, I mean, now what you see is you hear of death on a large scale, but you don't see people dying around you, because all the obscenity in that sense is happening in hospitals and other places in ICUs. But it wasn't like that in the earlier epidemics. You could actually, I mean, you had during the plagues, the many plagues, you would find dead vermin in gutters around you, drains full of effluents of sick people. You had disease-riddled corpses all around you on the streets. There was, in a sense, miasma, the miasma of death, that you don't get to see. Therefore, it was very different, and it's because of this the things are happening off scene. There's a kind of chasm or a gulf, which is the gulf of imagining. You tend to imagine what's happening in the hospitals, in the ICUs, and that's why you're scared. But you're not seeing death happening around you. When you head out, you can go to Khan Market wearing a mask, and you see that it's buzzing. You don't see the scary images around you.
And what do you think, whatever reading you would have done around the incident, then how did people react? What was going on through their minds? Are there any records of that? I mean, we know how they reacted in terms of moving away or so on. But are there any personal journals or records?
If you allow me, I'll read a small segment from the story. It'll tell you exactly what, if with your permission, if I'm allowed to do that.
Perfect.
Yeah. So this is from Bombay Bubonic. Hafkin had a theory that came from a fresh reading of the Chronicles of Plague. He believed that pestilences devalued life, changed its tenor. Following epidemics of plague, societies became restive and violent, wars broke out, flagellant movements were spawned, minorities were persecuted. The Parsis were particularly paranoid. Theirs was a small consanguineous community. The Bacillus pestis orientalis, sporeless and non-motile, had entered their world of milk and honey and thrown it into a roiling tizzy. All cases of fever were treated as suspects. Segregation of contacts was strictly enforced, and all plague suspects were removed and quarantined. Gangs of scoundrels started roaming the streets, claiming to represent the police or the municipality, blackmailing the Parsis, extorting money as they did under threats of picking them up. The newer hospitals in Bhuleshwar and Mandavi were attacked by throngs protesting against segregation and quarantine. There were rumors about a nexus of sellers, millers, and grain parchers who were offloading infected grain to Parsis to take over their wealth. There were 2 reported cases of Parsis from well-known families converting to Christianity. The Bombay Parsi Zoroastrian Anjuman, known for its rigor, had passed a lengthy resolution considering the re-entry of converts and the Barishnam ceremony for 9 nights. Parsis, thrivers by nature, were girdling each other, not allowing wounds in their faith. Will writing had reached epidemic proportions. Love had re-entered loveless marriages.
What are the markers of the Parsis here? We're talking about their wealth, of course, but what else? Is it the fact that they're a minority? How was that important?
No, it was a disproportionate concentration of wealth, which could have been, annexed by a lot of people when there was fear all around. The first thing that spreads in an epidemic is fear. It spreads faster than the pathogen, and I think so. Some of this has been taken from the archives, and it's instructive that I can't claim to be particularly well read in these matters, but the only book I referred to for texture and for the register is Daniel Defoe's
Journal of the Plague Year.
A plague year, yeah, and I read it in bits, and it's perhaps the most incredible literary hoax because it reads as the account of a witness, whereas it was written by someone who had no first-hand experience of plague in London. He was all of 5 years when it happened, and so some of those devices have been used, and a lot of archival material to try and recreate what it was like to live through an epidemic.
So what has changed since then, do you think, in the way people think about?
Curiously, in terms of interventions, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed from the time of the Justinian plagues. Forget about Bombay in 1896. You still have isolation, segregation, mitigation, quarantine. You know, you had juniper branches being burnt to disinfect the streets, and sulfur being used to disinfect homes and furniture and bed linen, none of which worked. Schools and marketplaces were shut down. Contacts were, quarantined for 40 days, and all of that. Nothing has changed. I'm reminded of one particular episode, which, in 1655, I don't know if you heard of this. This is called the Village of the Damned.
Mm-hmm.
This is in 1665, or whenever it hit England. This was a village called Eyam in Derbyshire. And curiously, what happens is that it's a small village, about 300 families or thereabouts, 250, 300 households or something like that. And someone arrives with a bale of cloth from London, which carries infected rat fleas. And these rat fleas are kind of rattled, and they start infecting the village. And very early on, there's a decision that's taken. I mean, the first response to this is to actually run and flee and escape the village. But a decision is taken to actually quarantine the village. Okay? Many people in the village could have easily run away, but the decision to quarantine the village is to actually try and prevent dissemination of spread so that the other communities in the other villages are spared. And this is an act of tremendous self-sacrifice. It's a moral question. And there's perhaps a religious angle to this, because this decision, to quarantine, is taken under the instructions of the rector of the parish there. And some of the families are forced to kind of quarantine, but they decide that they'll go ahead and do this. And 2/3 of the village is wiped out in the epidemic, but still they decide to carry on with the quarantine. They're not allowed to run. And I remember thinking about this during lockdown 1, when a lot of the laborers were asked to make that sacrifice and not leave and not flee. So it became a moral question of, should you be allowed to run and flee and save yourselves? Or should you become cannon fodder for the greater public good? And behavior is exactly the same. The incentives are exactly the same. The moral questions are exactly the same. The moral ask is exactly the same. And you can see this repeating itself pandemic after pandemic. Always happens.
But this is not a spontaneous response, right? It is very much a top-down set of orders with which people comply.
So one doesn't know. I mean, I have reasons to believe that there's a novel written about this, but it's a work of fiction. But I don't think there are any first-hand accounts or journals from Eyam available about what part of this was voluntary and what part of it was enforced. But a tremendous story. I mean, the Village of the Damned. Yeah.
Okay, now that is so frightening that I'm going to bring you right back to the present now and ask you for whether there is a possibility that we are not going to go to that situation here in India.
Well, I've been following the course of the pandemic, since practically January or February. I have been interested in this, and I've been following the events in China, and then as it moved to Europe and so on. And I've been speaking to a bunch of epidemiologists and virologists and a lot of people, and trying to read up and acquire some form of information on the virus. And it seems to me that there seems to be some evidence that as the virus is moving from country to country and moving through bodies, it seems to have lost its virulence. And this can be explained by an evolutionary theory. If you are to also look at the the 1918 pandemic of flu that hit India wiped out a lot of people. Almost 5% of the population of India was wiped out. But if you notice that it came into to Bombay and Bombay Presidency area, and then starts moving east. And as it moves east, as it moves to the eastern provinces, the number of deaths actually go down. It has something to do with the fact that it kind of timed itself with the monsoons, and the humidity increased and the heat increased, which aren't factors that the virus likes. But again, as it moved, it seems to me that the virus kind of lost its virulence. And this theory is not a new theory amongst virologists. So we tend to think of viruses as kind of diabolical creatures and, sentient creatures that want to kill, but it's not a very successful virus that kills the host, okay? Because the objective of the virus is actually to disseminate, to kind of propagate itself. If it manages to kill the host, it's a spectacular failure. So the Ebola virus is actually a failure because it manages, the case fatality rate is 50 to 80%. I'll tell you a story. Perhaps the most interesting natural experiment in evolutionary biology was carried out on a population of rabbits in Australia. Okay, this was a population of European rabbits in Australia, which was inoculated with this virus called the myxoma virus. And the objective was to control the population because they were breeding very rapidly. Now, the manner in which the myxoma virus attacks the host is that it produces these tumors, these myxomas, all over the body and kills off the host. Now, the vector of this virus is a mosquito. Okay, so in order to spread the viral infection, first of all, the tumor that the virus produces in the rabbit has to be under the skin so that the mosquito can reach it. The mosquito has to kind of bite exactly the right spot, pick up the virus, then find another rabbit, bite the rabbit again, inject it, and so on. It would necessitate the rabbit to live long enough for all this to happen. Okay. Now, the case fatality rate of the myxoma virus when it was introduced in the population of rabbits was 99%. It was managing to kill off practically every rabbit. So the rabbits were not living long enough for the virus to propagate itself. So the virus started changing. This was a sort of evolutionary change that happened. And by natural selection, the milder form of the virus start being selected naturally, which was allowing the rabbits to live longer, okay? And soon you found that the case fatality rate started dropping significantly, okay? Now, if you are to somehow take a crutch on this theory and look at SARS-CoV-2, the current virus we're dealing with, you will notice that the case fatality rate was pretty high, and the number of asymptomatic cases, the virus started moving into Europe. The asymptomatic cases, the asymptomatic cases in China were 1% to 7%. As the virus started moving into Europe, the asymptomatic cases came up to 30 to 40%. And now in India, we have some data that the number of asymptomatic cases could be as high as 70%. Okay? If you observe the number of infections and try and plot it against the daily deaths, even if you feel that the number of deaths are fudged, but obviously they can't be, fudged a great deal, you will notice that if you plot it from middle of April till now, you'll find that actually there's a declining trend of case fatality rate. Some of it could be due to the fact that you're testing more, but you can't deny that the infection is spreading rapidly. So if you have a rapidly spreading infection, the number of cases going up exponentially, but there's a kind of plateau as regards the number of deaths, the only inference you can draw is that the virus is becoming less and less virulent. Okay, and it's possible that you could be dealing with more than one strains of the virus. It's possible that the more virulent virus, which is producing symptoms and creating complications, is not allowing to escape because these patients are either dying or are being treated in hospitals where that strain of virus is being contained. And the asymptomatic cases which cannot be tested for whatever reason, it's either a shortage of kids or a disincentive to test or whatever, are spreading the attenuated, milder viral strain, and that's the one that's going around. So it's possible that in terms of absolute numbers as a proportion of the number of infections, we might not be as badly hit as perhaps Lombardy or New York or some of these places, but it's not something that you should be relieved about, because the denominator in India is always very large. The sheer volumes we deal with are massive. Therefore, even a case fatality rate of 0.5% will therefore become many, many deaths in India. But yes, there's some conclusion that you can draw in the matter that perhaps it's a milder or less virulent strain of the virus that we're dealing with.
And is there a way of this hypothesis with some proof from the data that's available currently? Is there a way in which this can be verified or validated at some point?
Unfortunately, it can't be, because there's no way of quantifying virulence of the organism. Okay, and because there's something that can't be measured or quantified, you can't write papers about it, and you can't get them peer reviewed. So something that is of immense help to the cause of public health cannot be quantified in this matter, and nobody's interested in a hypothesis that can't find its way into the Lancet. And this is my hypothesis, and this is many people have forwarded this. A very eminent scientist from Pune, I forget his name, has been talking about this for a while now.
No, and you're a doctor, so obviously it makes much more sense coming from you than from a WhatsApp forward. But which also brings me to a quick question. We are nearing the end of our time. So you've been on the front line as well on this entire period, and even if you're not directly treating patients with COVID-19, you're still performing procedures on them by virtue of being a vascular surgeon. So what's going on in your head through all of this?
Well, first of all, those blasted PPEs are unbearable. I mean, what's happened is that most of us tend to show up at work and get out of our clothes and get into those PPEs, and you then subsequently are functioning on a spinal level because your cerebral cortex doesn't function. You're 1 hour in those blasted hazmat things, and your cream starts to curdle, as they say. But it's frankly, I mean, you're worried about yourself, but you have to kind of trudge along. You're barely trying to keep your head above the water. You're worried about what's going to happen when you come back. Are you going to pass it on to your family? All of those concerns are there. And something very curious about, do you remember the plague doctor with the beaked mask? Do you remember that image of medieval England with those? Yes, the beaked mask. And I'm constantly reminded of that every time I climb into those hazmats, because now some of us have also acquired those full face or half face respirators, which look like gas masks, okay? Which have got those big filters, and it's actually like a gas mask. And then you get into those PPEs, okay, which are completely covering you. And if you go back to those plague doctors in medieval England, that's exactly what happened. They were completely covered in the black cloak. The cloak had been rubbed with wax so that it became waterproof. There was the mask, which was filled with, it wasn't meant to filter because they had no idea, they had no perception of what is causing this. They thought it was some form of miasma that you could just breathe in, and that's how contagion spread. But those beaks were full of herbs and spices and juniper berries and camphor, and so that it could somehow neutralize the miasma. There were the mask had some form of an orifice for the eyes, which was filled with glass. So it's exactly what you will find doctors wearing in ICUs. It's come a full circle. And but the great difference is that those searchers and those doctors during medieval England managed to save no one, and all our intensivists and pulmonologists are actually doing a great job in those hazmats.
Yes, yes. And that's another example of how little things have changed in terms of some of the externals, at least.
Yes.
So back to reading. Everyone, of course, has been trying to fish out their copy of Albert Camus' The Plague and trying to make sense of it, which was not about a plague at all, or at least not this kind. But is there something that you think we should be reading, and why?
Yes, I actually have a recommendation. I'm carrying it. I mean, I plucked it out from my shelf, but because you made the reference to Camus, the one time I remembered Camus during this current epidemic was actually during the Thali Bajana and the joyous celebration. And I remember the last paragraph of the book, because what was happening is that there was lockdown and we were jubilant that it hasn't hit India at all and we've managed to come out of it. And we thought that there was a kind of deus ex machina that had succeeded, that had delivered us, and we were celebrating. And the last paragraph is very clear. It's saying that it's almost as though that the organisms is kind of simmering in a saucepan. It's abiding its time. It's marking its time. And it's, to the bane of men, the rats are going to be roused again, and they're going to send forth those organisms to die in a happy city. So that's the only time I remember Camus. But yes, my recommendation is this one. This is called, I don't know if you can see it. It's called Room 000. Yeah, Kalpesh Ratna. Writers of extraordinary erudition and prowess. This is a fantastic, this is like a pulsatile history of, again, the Bombay Plague of 1896. But think about it as a Victorian novel of detection. Okay? It's fascinating. It's so 1896. Nobody has the feeblest idea about how the plague is transmitted. You've no idea. The organism is just about being isolated, but you've no idea how it's transmitted. And it's the most malevolent disease anybody has seen. And everybody involved in Bombay, the imperial government, the colonial police, the physicians and the surgeons in the city, the pioneering bacteriologists, all of them, this is like the perfect murder. This is the insoluble crime. It's like the locked room mystery. You don't know how this is happening. And it's happening over and over again, and it's unstoppable. Okay? And not just that, you don't know where it's come from. Did it come from Hong Kong, where it was festering in the earlier years? Was it brought by the itinerant sadhus of Garhwal, where it was it was thought the disease was endemic? And the reader, the reader is invited to solve this mystery of how the plot is actually the life cycle of the plague bacillus. You have to figure out the life cycle of the plague bacillus. So think of a splendid history of the plague set in 1896, which is also a mystery about what the life cycle of the plague bacillus is, which the readers are invited to solve, okay, using empirical techniques and the very basics of Holmesian forensics. It's fantastic, and it's borrowed so densely from Holmes. Even the titles of the chapters are fantastic. The Argyle Street Irregulars, the Solitary Scientist, the Blanched Soldier, the Missing Three Quarters, and my favorite, The Unconscious Travels of Lakshman Bhise.
The homage is clear, yes.
Fantastic. If any kind of reference to the Bombay Plague, please don't go to subaltern studies or those portentous tracts in peer-reviewed journals. This is the quivering mass of narratives you should go to. First rate, my recommendation.
So I'm glad you spoke about the Bombay Plague again, because now we have our questions coming in. And the first question comes from Ria, who says, what inspired you to write the story that you read out from? How did you pick up on it?
I'm a little fuzzy on inspiration. I don't know. It's just something that's kind of yanked me and got me interested. And started reading about it, and also the figure of Hafkin was very interesting, and I thought, and it's part of the larger stories that constitute the book Perineum, because Perineum is kind of sexual and scatological history of the British Raj, and all the stories are about that part of the body, the perineum, which is between the thighs, and which is where all, not just the plumbing is, but also the biological imperatives come from there. So it's part of that larger cycle of stories called Perineum, which is available in fine bookstores across the country.
Yeah.
And on Kindle now. I invite all the viewers to read it.
Yes, so would I. Yes. The question from Saddev Ramakrishna, he's alluding to your famous WhatsApp, which was meant for your neighbors in Gulmohar Park, but which, as you know, went national and probably has been read by people outside the country as well. So he's asking, given how articulate and a wonderful communicator you are there the seeds of your next book in there, in that WhatsApp message?
No, there is no next book as of now. I mean, I'm working on something, but it's not remotely related to this kind of stuff. Actually, I don't do public health, and I don't do health-related discourse. I try and stay away from it. If you've read my columns, it's it's completely different. So hopefully I wouldn't want to write about anything like this, and I hope we're done with this as quickly as possible, so that all of us can move on.
But is it possible that this experience will not make you think of writing something? It doesn't have to be directly about what happened.
I don't know. I mean, perhaps it hasn't come to me yet. It might. As I said, we're still on we almost reached the steep bit of the ascending arm of the curve. There's a lot of time left, so we don't know what's going to happen in the next 10 weeks. This is just a surge that's happening.
So the next two questions are related to what you just said. Om Prakash Parekh is asking whether you think another national lockdown would be useful. And I'll give you the next question as well. Veena Devaya asks what you think will happen to the congested areas, the slums, because they obviously do not have the facilities of quarantining and clean water and proper toilets that people elsewhere in the city have. So what's going to happen there? Are the governments doing enough?
Well, I've no doubt that the governments across the country are sincere in their efforts to try and change the situation. I don't know how effective they are. It's difficult. It's difficult. The only thing that this virus likes is density of population. That's the only thing, and therefore it's actually spreading very rapidly through the dense areas and dense urban clusters. But as I said, that perhaps the only thing that's going to save us are the asymptomatic carriers, because my sense is that the asymptomatic strain seems to be milder. It seems to be also less contagious. I'm not saying that it's not contagious. Of course it's contagious. This is a very contagious virus, but it seems to be, obviously, by virtue of not producing symptoms, because if you're producing symptoms, you're coughing, you're disseminating the virus through respiratory droplets, but by virtue of not producing symptoms, you are effectively less of a spreader. But I think all of us need to be vigilant. We need to, as that message stated, we need to behaviorally assume that the lockdown is underway. Extremely careful about indoor spaces, air-conditioned environments where there isn't too much air circulation, because the virus in respiratory droplets, and if it's aerosolized in small droplets, can be airborne for a little longer if there's no ventilation. So it affects commensality in terms of shared meals. We have to be careful. We have to be careful about using shared washrooms, but of course, I think 85% of us will come out of this completely unaffected and unscathed and with very mild symptoms, if at all.
So there is a last question. It's probably will require a very technical answer, but I'm passing it on to you anyway. What is your informed view on the possibility that COVID-19 is a vascular infection rather than a virus?
No, of course, indeed. There's, it's quite well established that it produces intravascular thrombosis, particularly in the small vessels. And that was creating a lot of confusion early on in the course of the disease. And we've learned immensely from the Chinese and from the Spaniards and from the Italians and the Germans. And therefore, the number of cases that are being salvaged in ICUs by critical care experts is increasing. And because what tends to happen is that sometimes the picture that you see in the lungs is very similar to that of what's known as ARDS, a respiratory distress syndrome, of florid pneumonias. But what's happening is that it's actually a consequence of thrombosis in the small vessels of the lung, and that has to be treated slightly differently. So it's quite well established. In fact, we've been seeing cases of thrombosis in the larger vessels, and also some of them in the coronaries, that in my discussions with some cardiologists, as a consequence of COVID. And we've had to operate on some of these patients to remove the clots that are forming in the blood vessels. So yes, it's some part of the manifestations are clearly vascular in nature, indeed.
So very quickly, I know we are all talking about the vaccine, but what are your hopes on medicines that can work?
No, I don't know. Medicines that can work, it's difficult to actually produce, to come up with medicines that will stop fast replicating virus, such as this. Some of the trials that are underway on some of the medicines show some benefit in a small subset of patients. So you have to be guarded in offering that to all your patients. But my sense is that I think there will be some form of an endemic equilibrium that will be achieved, in my view, by the end of the year. That this is going to remain as a kind of seasonal flu amongst the population. This is exactly what's happened to H1N1. H1N1, when it first made its appearance, was a dreaded respiratory infection. And it has now managed to become a fairly mild and fairly innocuous seasonal flu that comes every season, and it affects some of us. Most of us, just have a flu-like illness, and we're done with it. I think by the end of the year, hopefully, we would have achieved that sort of an endemic equilibrium with this illness.
Right. I think we'll end our session on that note of mild hope. And thank you very much, Ambarish.
Thank you, Ambarish, and thank you, Arunava, for that fascinating session. It's absolutely incredible how the virus across the ages continues to sort of haunt us. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. Please do remember to log back on Wednesday, the 9th of September, to view another set of brilliant sessions. And remember, do block your dates for JLF London at the British Library from 11th to 13th September. The program is available to be viewed on our website, jlflitfest.org. Stay safe, stay well.